the contours of economy and the implications for direct taxes. Friends, we are beginning the afternoon session of this wonderful webinar, and you've been already addressed by Dr. Rangarajan and Dr. Manoj Pant, the director of the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade. And now it is a matter of great pride and pleasure for all of us to welcome Dr. Lekha Chakraborty for this session. I have the pleasure of inviting my Joint Director, Madam Ankita Singh, to speak a few words.
Very good afternoon, ma'am. To all the senior officers who are attending this course today with us and have been with us since morning, and all the participants from the field. And ma'am, a very warm welcome to you for this session. And sir will be introducing to our participants about the detailed bio of ma'am. But ma'am, we have been in the past two sessions, if you've seen the flyer for the course, we have been introduced at least to the Dr. Rangarajan. He took us to the journey of India's economic performances and the steps taken by the government, wherein and what we were pre-independence and where we are now. And your topic, ma'am, is very relevant, very topical, which is precisely about talking about India's economic performance in since independence. I believe, ma'am, you'll be talking about that. So, ma'am, on behalf of our institute, National Academy of Direct Taxes, Regional Campus, Lucknow, we wholeheartedly welcome you. We are grateful that you accepted our invite on such short notice and accepted to take this session for us, ma'am. We hope to invite you personally to the campus once we open with our offline classes. I urge all the participants to listen to the lecture carefully, as they were very, our participants here, ma'am, are very engaging, very participative, and they've been raising very good questions and queries. We will be taking the questions in the chat box. This is for all the participants, and the moderator here will be taking up the questions, ma'am, for you at the end of the session. So once again, ma'am, very warm welcome on behalf of us. Now I request Arvind Mishra sir to please give a detailed bio of ma'am and invite you.
Okay, now we move on with this session, and as you all are aware that the department is going through a tremendous, huge transformation in its knowledge resources, in the methods of implementation of the strategies in the service of the nation, so that the citizens can all come together to contribute to the utmost capacity in the interest of all our people. The state of the economy also needs to be understood, which is the broader perspective within which the tax environment functions. So we have with us the best experts in the discipline who are going to discuss and offer their views on the various aspects related to tax implications of the economy. I have the pleasure of giving a small introduction of the vast achievements of Dr. Lekha Chakraborty. Friends, Dr. Lekha Chakraborty is a professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, which is the think tank for the government of India. Professor Lekha Chakraborty is the elected member of the governing board of management for the International Institute of Public Finance at Munich, which is the World Association of the Public Finance Economists. She is also the pioneer economist in institutionalizing gender budgeting in India, along with the chief economic advisor, which is at the Ministry of Finance, Government of India in 2004. Dr. Chakraborty is also a research affiliate at the Levy Economics Institute of Bard College, New York. Her areas of interest are macroeconomics of public finance, fiscal federalism, extractive sector economics, financing human development, and gender budgeting. She is also Ma'am is also the recipient of the Infosys Best PhD Thesis Award from the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. Professor Chakraborty is the author of Fiscal Consolidation, Budget Deficits, and Macroeconomics, which is published by Sage Publications. This book has received endorsement reviews from Mr. Y.V. Reddy, who was the former governor of Reserve Bank of India, and also from Vito Tanzi, former IMF Executive Director of Fiscal Affairs. Dr. Chakraborty is the co-author of the book Social Sector in Decentralized Economy, India in the Era of Globalization, which is published by the Cambridge University Press. She has worked for the IMF, for the World Bank, for UNESCAP, the UNDP, the UN Women in Commonwealth Secretariat on short stints. Her work experience on macro fiscal policy and human development spans across 8 countries and more frequently in the Asia Pacific region. She was twice the awardee of the Shastri Indo-Canada program from Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for the Government of Canada. She was the visiting professor at American University, Washington, D.C., the Uppsala University at Sweden, the Carleton University in Canada, and of course the University of Utah in US. She also has papers in national and international journals. Dr. Lekha Chakraborty is a columnist in the Indian Express, Hindu, the Financial Express, the Business Line, Business Standard, almost so many newspapers and magazines published within and outside the country, and also the publications of Rajya Sabha, the All India Radio World Air Service, the DD News, etc. If you were to look at the newspapers carefully, and you'll find that so many articles are being written by Dr. Lekha Chakraborty there. She's one of the most prolific writers on economics related topics. So here we have Madam who's going to speak to us about the macroeconomic initiatives that could be taken in the present times, where India is facing a challenging situation in the geopolitical sphere as well as the national sphere. So the topic is macro policy response for economic recovery. Madam, a big welcome to you from the NADT RC Lucknow, and Lucknow in its very tehzeeb would like to welcome you sometime to Lucknow also for a session. But here we are focused upon you completely and almost very excited to hear you speak. Thank you very much, ma'am. Please, you can start. Ma'am, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's fine. We can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Arvindji and Ankita, for your kind words, and hope that after this worries are over, I hope to visit your academy, one day. And I was so happy when Ankita told that this is going to be a very interactive session. So let me confine my talk to around 20-25 minutes, and we can open the floor and can have a very interactive session. I can answer to the questions and concerns of the officers, and it's my privilege to talk to them, and we can make it interactive. And to begin with, when we talk about the macroeconomic policy responses for the economic recovery, the first thing is about the analytical framework. And if we believe that in an emerging country context like India, if we have business cycles operating in the context of India, then the kind of policy tools, whether it is monetary policy or fiscal policy, what we formulate is a kind of intergovernmental or a kind of countercyclical fiscal or countercyclical monetary policy tools. There I have a question, because these kind of crisis and recession and the pandemic times, the economy experiences is not business cycles. It's a kind of a permanent scar. In that context, if the fiscal policy and monetary policy are acting as a countercyclical policy tool, then we will not get the growth recovery perfect. So that's a punch I would love to give to you. We can all discuss when we open the floor, but that's a concern I have. Uh, you know, a growth process has cyclicality elements and structural elements. So when fiscal policy and monetary policy focusing on a growth recovery process just from the perspective of cyclicality, then we won't get the growth recovery perfect. And another concern is for whom the economy is recovering. Is it uneven? Then the fiscal policy has a major role to play over there. And in the writings of eminent economists like Oliver Blanchard, Geeta Gopinath, these concerns are coming up quite clearly. And let us take the concerns of Oliver Blanchard first. So what he mentioned is that in the time of economic recession, of course, let's begin from the fiscal policy. We floated a very accommodative fiscal policy stance. Accommodative in the sense our debt is mounting, deficit is mounting, but it is not confined to what is happening within India. It's happening globally that we are learning to live with very high deficit and very high debt. And that's a matter of concern. When the fiscal policy is accommodative, we have to ask the question whether fiscal policy, accommodative fiscal policy, is growth enhancing or fiscal discipline is growth enhancing. Because over the years, what we have experienced is that we have gone through a phase of fiscal rules, like we have a norm or a threshold ratio of 3% to GDP, the fiscal deficit. In the time of pandemic and in the time of recession, we have started rethinking about that, whether we should be adhering to a strict fiscal rules. Because in the time of economic recovery during a pandemic, when taxes are not buoyant, then you are prompt for expenditure compression to get to that level of fiscal discipline. So that cannot be growth enhancing. That's why from a power of strength, when Finance Minister Srimati Nirmala Sitharaman announced a high fiscal deficit, so from a power of strength, she announced that she's quite okay with a high fiscal deficit because these are the moments in which we don't have to fear high fiscal deficit. And in the writings of Oliver Blanchard, which I mentioned, globally, there's a fundamental rethinking about the accommodative fiscal policy stance by keeping, fiscal deficit and fiscal debt high, and substantiating that with linking it to, reducing the output gap and also linking it to enhancing the growth recovery process through capital infrastructure investment. So the theory says that if you increase the public investment, then it naturally crowds out private corporate investment. But the narrative we have heard in the last budget is high fiscal deficit and high public investment is going to crowd in private corporate investment. So, these are neoclassical thoughts that this crowding out. And, that is based on the assumption that in the economy, when your loanable funds are limited, and in that limited loanable funds pool, if the government is preempting these loanable funds to finance the deficit, what is available to the private corporate sector is going to be lower than before. If that is the case, it's going to increase the interest rate. So that's a narrative of this neoclassical economist. But this neoclassical theory is refuted from a power of strength by finance minister that in the context of emerging economies like India, it's not crowding out, but it's going to crowding in the moment you tie it up to enhancing capital infrastructure or reducing the output gap. And what exactly is output gap? Enhancing capital infrastructure, that is quite clear. But what exactly is reducing output gap? In an economy, you have a potential output and an actual output. And actual output is, of course, in India, we measure it through GDP. But in the context of Western economies, they take into consideration the employment potential of the economy. And output gap is a difference between the potential output and the actual output. And potential, that is an unobserved variable. How do you measure the potential of an economy? And this is, through many econometric methodologies and all, economists, RBI and North Block, They come up with an estimate on the potential by taking out the fluctuations or taking out the cyclicality in the series and call that trend as potential. You can understand that in the GDP, it has cyclical elements and it has got an overall long-term trend element. So what basically we call as potential output is take out the cyclicality elements and we call that as trend. That's a potential output. And it's controversial because you can understand that the prediction frontier, that is quite a concept of an envelope. It's not the trend. So these methodological limitations are there. But despite all these things, we arrive at the potential output, by taking out the cyclicality elements. So that itself is controversial. And as I mentioned earlier, in the writings of Geeta Gopinath, who is a IMF, a chief economist, in her writings also, you can see that, this dating the business cycles, like dating in the sense, the ups and downs in the context of an emerging economy is little tricky in the sense, what we experience as a fall from the prior pandemic, economic growth, that fall may not be cyclical, so that fiscal and monetary policy acting as a counter-cyclical policy tool can take it back to, that V-shaped or U-shaped recovery, what we anticipate, it can take it back to the prior pandemic levels. No, because when, these decline or these drop in GDP, when that scarring process, when that's a permanent scar, then the cyclical policies will not work. So that's the important thing we need to keep in mind when we talk about the macroeconomic policy responses for economic recovery, because it should not be just confined to cyclicality. That's why when you unpack the economic pandemic packages in the context of India and in other countries, you can observe that there are two important components to economics and economic stimulus package. And one component is, of course, as I mentioned, this firefighting, that cyclicality elements, how to tackle. So those kind of policies. And other is you use this crisis as an opportunity to float certain structural, reforms. And structural reforms, it can be power sector reforms, it can be labor market reforms, banking reforms. So there are, many structural impediments in the economy. Unless we tackle that, then, it's not a magic that once you put forward, counter-cyclical fiscal and monetary policy, then you're going to get back the economic growth process. Now let's compare the, that package between the economic, this pandemic period with the prior global economic recession. After the global financial crisis, monetary policy was given due importance. So we thought that monetary policy is a wonderful counter-cyclical policy tool which can take the economy back to the prior crisis levels of growth. But we failed in the sense the prime instrument of that economic policy package that time was monetary policy, and the prime instrument of monetary policy is always the interest rate. So adjusting the policy rates, you believe that you can take back the economy to the prior recession levels, but that didn't happen because you kept on decreasing the interest rate, and beyond a point when it reaches zero bound or even the negative quadrant, then it stops to trigger the economy. In the sense you enter into a liquidity trap. So monetary policy failed as a counter-cyclical policy when it became zero bound. But right now, look at what is the RBI response to the pandemic, the RBI response to economic recovery process. So initially, RBI has floated a lot of liquidity infusion techniques. Liquidity infusion in the sense we believe that the credit infusion is going to be the predominant methodology of economic recovery process, but it has got its own limitations. And using various toolkits, RBI responded. One was Operation Twist. Operation Twist in the sense you play with the maturity structure of the securities or the bond markets, in the sense you simultaneously buy a lot of long-term securities and sell short-term securities in the sense that the refinancing risk is postponed. So you are getting a space to tackle the robust growth process because your refinancing risk is postponed to more than 40 years or 50 years. If you have within the debt structure, if you have many long-term securities than short-term. So that was one way in which we have done the liquidity infusion. Then another way, the targeted repo rate operations, in which the stress sectors were targeted and the liquidity infusion or the liquidity was given to those stress sectors. Then, of course, we have the usual open market operations and, of course, the government security acquisition program. So we kept the repo rate low at 4% since May 2020. And we were quite comfortable with that because it was required for the growth recovery process. But now the things are getting complicated in the sense we have to face a lot of global uncertainties, energy price volatility, food inflation is mounting. So in that era, if you keep the interest rate low, then that can be little conflicting in the sense you have to face the capital flight if the US Fed Reserve keep on increasing the interest rates of Fed Reserve, and that's going to happen, and it's happening. In the Jackson Hole meetings and all, we got that narrative quite all right that they are going to decrease the balance sheet of the Fed Reserve. So when Jay Powell is quite keen to increase the interest rate in a series, and if they are in a mood to decrease the balance sheet, that rise in the interest rate, it can attract the capital from emerging economies. In the sense, in the emerging economies, if you look at the forex, if you look at the foreign capital, a part of it is hot. And hot money, by definition, responds to interest rate differentials. And in which country interest rate is high, the capital will be flighting. So we need to prevent the capital flight. We have to face the mounting inflation. And also you look at the financialization of savings. And you and me and the middle class, if you look at the segments of Indian population, we are comfortable in investing money in the banking sector, and we look into the term deposits, and if the interest rate is high, we are quite comfortable. But in the time of pandemic, when the rate of interest was plummeting, that was affecting financialization of savings. Now, through the new monetary policy framework that was envisaged in 2016, the prime objective of the central bank or the prime objective of RBI is to look into the price stability. And you have to keep the inflation under control. But in the time of pandemic, the sequence of the priority of the central bank became growth first. That reverse of the sequence of the priority happened just now from growth first narrative to inflation containment, that price stability again. And now, if the interest rate is mounting, two things. It is good for preventing capital flight. It is good for preventing this mounting inflation from happening. It is good for the financialization of savings. But on the other hand, it's bad for the government when they engage in the bond financing of deficit. If the interest rate is going higher, then the cost of borrowing of the government is going higher. That's why you always felt a tug of war between the RBI and the North Bloc to keep the interest rate lower, because then you can also ask me the question why there is a conflict of interest in the RBI mandate, because RBI is also getting into the public debt management and as well as inflation targeting, and this is conflicting. And FSLRC, and when the inflation targeting framework was envisaged in our country, we discussed all these things, that the moment exactly what we are facing right now, this was discussed that time. What will happen to that inflation targeting framework when we have to keep the the public debt management also on board? So that many economists argue that the public debt management has to be entirely taken out from RBI, and it has to be an independent agency doing this. Otherwise, North Bloc always wanted us to keep the interest rate lower because the cost of borrowing will remain lower. But at the same time, the inflation targeting framework is a framework where you peg the rate of interest based on inflation anchor you mandate in the country through that agreement between RBI and Government of India. Then it's deviation from the inflationary expectations. That inflationary expectations is again an unobserved variable, and we have floated inflation survey in India, expectation survey in India since 2011 to capture the expectations, and then the output gap, which I have already mentioned. So output gap, inflationary expectations, and the inflation anchor. And by mandate, inflation anchor is 4%, and we have a band of plus and minus 2. So, a comfort zone of inflation is up to 6%. And beyond 6%, we are not comfortable. And if that happens with 3 consecutive quarters, then RBI is answerable, and we need to look into the mandate. And there could be major revisions in the new monetary policy framework. And now we are waiting that in what manner RBI is going to respond to this crisis, because 3 consecutive quarters or 4 consecutive quarters, the inflation is mounting above 6%. And if you look at the CPI inflation, the inflation which RBI controls, there are many inflation, WPI, CPI, and RBI's mandate is, linked to CPI inflation, and that's mounting beyond 6% right now, and we are above this comfort zone. So right now, how to respond to it? Initially, in last MPC meetings, RBI responded to this crisis not by touching the interest rates that time. They kept it at 4%, but they introduced a new policy tool of standing deposit facility to address this concern. That was not a post-pandemic innovation. That instrument was there in Urjit Patel committee recommendations about this, inflation targeting and the new monetary policy framework, that we tried to nudge, the commercial banks not to park back in the government securities when we were facing that liquidity crunch, and liquidity infusion was the predominant narrative of the economic policy. But that time, the repo rate was never attractive. But right now, we made the repo rate redundant. And if you look at that monetary policy corridor, the base is the SDF right now. It's not the reverse repo rate. And based on that SDF, we kept it in an attractive manner in which the commercial banks will park back their securities with RBI. That was happening. If you look into the credit deployment and the SLR requirements, the banks were investing quite well above the statutory liquidity ratios and that commitment. And banks were analyzing that from the perspective that there is no enough demand in the market. So the supply side economics was working, and the credit deployment was the predominant narrative in which the economic, stimulus package was designed. But that led to an uneven growth recovery, because the credit access itself was uneven. Who accessed the credit? We can take a look into the RBI statistics, and big firms have accessed the credit. And if you look into the YOY, growth process, you may find that the growth in the credit of the lower, or the small firms or the medium firms may be good. But if you look at the composition, then who accessed the credit? That remains a question, a major question. And personal loans were on high to pay back the credit. So the credit deployment statistics was giving a different kind of a credit culture when we look into the statistics. So as Stiglitz, Nobel laureate, pointed out, that if the predominant narrative of economic stimulus packages or the macroeconomic response to recovery is through credit, then that has limited multiplier effects. So that was the concern. And now we have an excessive deficit procedure path. And we do believe that taxes will be buoyant. And this year, the tax officials, it better than me, we were very conservative in projections, in tax projections, because after the pandemic, in the post-pandemic fiscal strategy, if IMF and many multilateral agencies start looking into the budget credibility exercise, then it is quite important for India to show that there is no enough deviation between what is budgeted and what is the actual. So if we project, or if we anticipate, or if our aspirations to get it, at very high level, and if you don't realize that, then that questions the budget credibility of a country. So maybe that's one of the reasons why we have a very conservative estimates this year for the tax projections, for the disinvestment proceeds, because we didn't, find it quite cool in the last two budgets, that deviation. When you look into the fiscal marksmanship of, that investment, which is a non-tax, or the capital receipt side, we didn't get the picture quite good for the disinvestment or the privatization proceeds. But privatization proceeds was the predominant narrative of fiscal space, because when everything else failed, when the taxes were not buoyant in the time of pandemic, the predominant narrative of our government was to go ahead with privatization to increase, to enhance the fiscal space. But that didn't work well as we anticipated because of the exogenous factors. That is also quite crucial. When we talk about budget credibility, we need to look into the sources of fiscal forecasting errors. And the sources can be the bias of the policymaker or the tax projection or the model, built by the policymakers. It can also lead, because of the random factors. And technically, it is possible to analyze. Like in an IPFP, we have done a work. Lekha Chakraborty, our former director, myself, and Rusil Srishta, we have looked into the fiscal forecasting errors of center government and the state governments and tried to trichotomize the sources of errors. And in that sources of errors, we found that most of the macro fiscal parameters, the fiscal or forecasting errors happen due to randomness. Then we cannot blame a policymaker or a tax projection model, why this has happened, because it's random. But in the context of certain subnational governments and in certain time period, we understood that intergovernmental fiscal transfers showed little bit of volatility, and capital spending showed volatility, and also the tax projections. So there we need to understand whether the volatility in the capital spending was due to fiscal rules, because we over-adjusted to fiscal rules by reducing the capex or the capital spending. And over the years, the narrative of the growth process was consumption-led. It was, if you meticulously check, it was never capital formation led in the recent years. So that course correction was done in the last budget when finance minister announced that we will be focusing on the growth enhancing process through crowding in of private investment by emphasizing on the capex. So we have to wait and see that emphasis on the gross capital formation, and that's very crucial to look into. Intergovernmental fiscal transfer, the tax transfers, that volatility was like there was a shift in the process of a discretionary transfers to more unconditional transfers after the 14th Finance Commission. So there was a grand restructuring happened over there. So maybe that's the reason why the little bit of volatility was shown in the fiscal forecasting error process when we look into that. But now it may get corrected. But that transition from the discretion to unconditional grants, that is unconditional tax transfers based on the of tax transfer formula, that's welcome. Now the final point is you have to go ahead from the growth, economic growth, as the prime narrative of macro fiscal policy. If economic growth is a prime narrative of macro fiscal policy in the times of pandemic, then we believe that once you correct the growth recovery process, that gets naturally translated into human development. But humanitarian crisis is mounting, so we need to focus on the elements like social infrastructure policies, social security measures, food security. In many countries that can lead to even civil war. In the time of pandemic, that starvation, deaths, and those kind of concerns are very crucial. And so we need to focus on the food security, which rightly we have done. And the last is government acting as an employer of last resort. So when everything else failed, the government has to act as an employer of last resort by guaranteeing jobs to the people. So we have enhanced the fiscal space, but certain, a part it was not working. But with enhanced fiscal space, what exactly is the narrative of the macro fiscal policy? Whether that is an participation income or basic income, because our former chief economic advisor was quite keen about universal basic income by providing cash transfers into the hands of people to tackle recession. But Rekram Rajan and many economists pointed out that these cash transfers, if they in the hands of the people, if they focus more on the propensity to save in the process of saving rather than spending, then economic recovery may get delayed. So in this process, in this policy narrative of participation income versus economic or the universal basic income, Indian government emphasized more on the participation income by providing guaranteed jobs. But if you look into the cash transfers, those were quite targeted cash transfers to Kisan, little bit the care economy infrastructure. Otherwise, the prime narrative was, of course, the participation income. So you have to check both the fiscal and monetary policy. And monetary policy right now, the RBI has bitten the bullet. They have increased the interest rate right now. But now the concern is if this growth expectations or the growth recovery process can get damaged or can get decatalyzed. But that policy dilemma is always there, that if you don't increase the interest rate, then we cannot anchor the inflationary expectations. Right now, inflation is mounting globally, and I do believe that it's the right time RBI increase the interest rate, because women when we think about monetary policy, theory says that, or the career theory says that women their thinking process we could be little hawkish in the approach, like for the financialization of savings, we thought about this capital flight, and we think about inflation and we keep the interest rate little higher. So I don't know what's the details of that, but studies, career theory says that women tend to think in a hawkish manner. And right now, even prior to the June meetings of MPC, we have called the MPC meetings, and announced that this monetary policy corridor, it needs to be maneuvered differently, so that that normalization process can begin right now. And earlier than expected normalization process is now on board. What exactly is the normalization process? Because we announced a lot of economic stimulus packages, and normalization is we are rolling it back. And we have not yet announced the excessive deficit procedure. In the last budget, in the last but one budget, that excessive deficit procedure was 4.5% of deficit to GDP by 2025-26. So that narrative is fixed, and fiscal policy is remaining a very accommodative. But monetary policy, earlier than expected, they increased the interest rate because of the mounting inflationary pressures that's happening globally, because of the energy volatility, because of the pressures from the Fed Reserve, and the war in Ukraine, the consignments are getting delayed, the supply chain disruptions. So due to all these things, and now you may ask me the question: how can the RBI anchor the inflationary expectations when inflation is predominantly supply side? But RBI always defend that can be anchored through the inflationary expectations, but empirical evidence is very inconclusive about a one-to-one relationship between the repo rate, adjusting the repo rates and economic growth recovery process. And also there is inconclusive empirical evidence about whether inflation targeting framework can anchor the inflationary expectations. But by mandate, RBI needs to be looked into only the financial stability and the price stability. And now climate change is also a matter of concern, and there's a tug of war when we think about the macroeconomic recovery process. The climate change is a very crucial element in it. And the tug of war is, if RBI or any central bank is getting into distinguishing between the green bond and the brown bond, then they can go little political. That's a sense. Political in the sense, the political economy of the green bonds and the brown bonds can be tackled better by the fiscal policy makers than RBI or a central bank. That's a way, even Lekha Chakraborty argues that don't get into this. It can lead to reputation risk if you get into the climate change commitments, because your prime mandate is financial stability. But economists always question that argument, because in turn, these risk and uncertainties from the climate change can also affect the financial stability. So in Bank of England, they floated green stress test, asked the top bankers, investors to come up with a stress test. So those kind of exercises of greening the monetary policy, it has been done by many countries, and including Christine Lagarde of European Central Bank. And RBI is open to those discussions of greening the monetary policy, but in general, we feel that fiscal policy can do it better through ecological fiscal transfers, which happen through, the Finance Commission, 14th Finance Commission. We have incorporated the climate change as a criteria of tax transfers, and 15th Finance Commission retained it. In the last budget, we announced climate bonds, the sovereign bonds that is getting earmarked. It is getting earmarked to a specific purpose, and it's a kind of a first experiment in the context of India, that we are earmarking a specific, the financing of the deficit through, bond financing to the green infrastructure. So these are new experiments. We have to wait and see, and we are also going digital. Of course, crypto is not a currency. Crypto is, of course, a speculative asset. It's a high return, high risk asset, and only a small segment of business people are engaging in that. But we have the tax policy to curb that speculative activity. RBI has also, showed a little alarm regarding this by saying it like it is not even worth tulips. But at the same time, Finance Minister has made it very clear that using the tax policy, we are not making it legitimate. We have to wait for the regulatory mechanisms to be on board regarding that digital asset, not a currency, because always the legal digitized tender, digitized is the CBDC. That also Indian government has announced in the last budget that India will go ahead with the CBDC, and that is based on the financial integrity and the trust models, because otherwise the fraudulence can happen. We have to wait and see how it is going to get implemented in India. But many economists are very positive about it in terms of, that strengthening financial inclusion. CBDC is very crucial, and that's very relevant for fiscal monetary policy coordination as well. And Arvindji, I stop here and look forward to the questions, from the officers. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you very much for your wonderful session. And there are a few questions that I can see in the chat box. One question that I can see is that if fiscal deficit is very high, then could it be a risk?
Yeah, I will take the questions one by one. Okay. How high fiscal deficit helps the economy given the way Sri Lanka has gone? Oh, this question from Harish Ji. Thank you so much for asking me. But I can clarify that. There is little bit difference between the financing pattern of a deficit. If you look into India, it's a diverse economy. Sri Lanka is a small closed economy, island economy. So that external, those kind of things happen to Sri Lanka will not happen to India. Mainly because if you look into the financing pattern of deficit, we have come a long way from the seigniorage financing of deficit to bond financing of deficit. But if you look into, the external and internal composition of the bond market or the deficit, the external financing of deficit in India is quite negligible. If you look into that, we don't have much external financing of deficit in the context of India. The way there is a donor presence, China and all in, external commercial borrowings and all in Sri Lanka. So that's a major difference. So it's under control. We are focusing on the financing of deficit through bond financing, which is internal. So that's a major difference. Second is the use of fiscal space. There's a little difference between the way we use, excuse me, yes, there's a difference between the way we use the fiscal space and, in Sri Lanka, many populist measures happened, which are not a long-term model at all. So focusing on the welfare models, which is not sustainable in the long run. But of course, India also experimented with little welfare models like that, like how to incentivize the calculus of consent or calculus of voting behavior of people, how we can maneuver that consent. So there's a tendency for the government to get into those kind of incentivizing the mandate or the populist measures, but those cannot be of long term. Excuse me. That's why, the narrative of capex, we have high fiscal deficit, high debt, but linking that to capital formation or linking that to strengthening public infrastructure, that's welcome. So there are differences, major differences between the fiscal space and the use of fiscal space and the financing pattern of deficit between Lanka and India. So that's what I'm not worried at all that it is going to get replicated in India. No. Now, thank you, Harish, for that question.
Shumana Sen, ma'am, would you like to ask your question? Shumana Sen.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Shimona Sen, and first of all, let me congratulate you for such a lovely lecture. You highlighted, the various aspects of fiscal and monetary policy so well, and it was so well elucidated that everything was crystal clear. Thank you for that. My question is that in the background of the pandemic, and then now this trade-off between inflation and economic growth, and in the last year, we have seen inflation happening, and we have seen how the rise in interest rates in the US can lead to outflow of capital from here. And then we are seeing various other parameters here as high, such as the depreciation of the rupee, and then we are seeing increased balance rate deficit. In the background of all this, so in this kind of mix, how do you account for the high buoyancy of tax collections that we witnessed?
Oh, thank you. Shuhana, right?
Yeah, Shumona. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that question. The macroeconomic uncertainties and how it can be linked to the tax buoyancy. Good. The way you narrated that, that shows that dilemma. On the one side, we have external pressures, global uncertainties, and, as you rightly mentioned about the behavior of the Fed Reserve, the fragile economies will face, issues when they behave like, beggar thy neighbor. That's a way, Raghuram Rajan has defined it, that if they keep on increasing the interest rate, then the capital will be flighty. So how to prevent all these things? Of course, as you mentioned, there has to be a fiscal and monetary policy coordination. And let's take the fiscal policy later. Let's take the monetary policy. As you mentioned, we increase the interest rate, but then the growth recovery process can be little delayed. And increase in interest rate means inflation. Mounting inflation is a matter of concern right now. So we kept it at high, 4.4 right now, the repo rate. So right now what can happen is, the cost of the borrowings is going to be higher. And we have a fiscal consolidation path ahead. And that fiscal consolidation path, if it is through the expenditure compression rather than, tax buoyancy, it will definitely affect growth recovery process. And when growth recovery process is suffering, it's in a doldrum, that can affect the tax revenue. So it's a kind of, vicious circle. But at the same time, if you increase the tax rate, to get, tax revenue, you know it better than me that beyond a point, especially in the time of pandemic, increase the tax rates will not work. That's why Government of India has not taken that path at all. So to increase the interest rate, but decreasing the tax rates, that also we have not done. And tax buoyancy, it depends on the economic growth recovery. At the same time, you mentioned that dilemma for the economic growth recovery, we have to keep the interest rates lower, but now interest rate is, it is little higher. So we have to see, what's a way that's coming up. That what it's a full circle right now, and this is exactly the dilemma of, Shaktikant Das this moment, because many economists criticize him criticized him for increasing the interest rate, but at the same time, his articulation right now is inflation containment is also crucial for growth recovery process. So the question of tax buoyancy, that depends on the economic growth recovery process. And economic growth recovery process, it is not one-to-one with your interest rate, but that narrative of fiscal policy to keep high deficit and linking it to the capital formation economy by pumping in that private corporate investment. If this channel works, then things will be bright. Otherwise, I don't think that the point I will clarify. Monetary policy has got limited space. Maneuvering the interest rates and getting into economic growth, that one-to-one has got limited efficacy, the efficacy of the monetary policy framework. So fiscal policy needs to be accommodative for growth recovery process. How fiscal policy can be accommodative? We have to live with little bit of high deficits and high debt till 2025. That's the way Indian government has narrated. So let's see whether that recovery process will lead to tax buoyancy. That is one thing. Second, tax administration is also tax policy. So we have to see what are the digital infrastructure and what are the ease of doing business components needs to be implemented to increase the tax revenue. So the buoyancy is related to the growth process, the tax administration, and always not related to increasing the interest rates. And Suhana, you know it better than me, and you can supplement, if you have further points, I'm open to your ideas.
Thank you. So do you think that economic growth is kicking in already, going by the high tax collections that we witnessed for the last fiscal year?
No, it's not one-to-one. You mean to say that high tax leading to high growth? No, because
no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying last year we witnessed a very high growth, or we witnessed a very high tax rate collection.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. So is it indicative of the fact that the economy is growing? Because where is that tax coming from?
Oh,
that is what I'm saying.
Then also I have to emphasize on this uneven growth recovery, because at the moment we can celebrate that there is growth recovery happening, our taxes are buoyant. But if you look into the GDP, then this concern is real, that it is profit-led growth recovery. The people belong to the lower end of the pyramid. We don't have concrete policies to deal with their issues. Of course, economy has grown. Economy is growing, but the concern is the growth is uneven, and the fiscal policy needs to look into that. And I do, agree with you with the, conclusion that there is economic growth recovery because its taxes are buoyant. But my concern is, in order to get that sustainable, this growth process sustainable, fiscal and monetary policy coordination is crucial, because we have issues from the external global uncertainties as well. One. Second, the economic growth happened, but it happened for whom? It was an uneven growth recovery. So I do take your point that economic growth recovery happened, but the concern is it's an uneven growth recovery.
Thank you so much.
Okay, any other question? One, Mr. Akhilesh Lal has raised a question. Would you like to raise your question, Mr. Lal?
Thank you, madam. Thank you for your words to Income Tax Department. My question is, what is the effect of war on taxation in India?
Okay. Thank you, Alishji. Energy price volatility is a matter of concern. And if you get into the taxation related to the fuel in the time of pandemic, that can be a little tricky, because the disposable income in the hands of people will come down. So there's a political economy to it. It's a very political, a decision, and we have to wait and see. But Government of India has not yet announced regarding the hiking of this thing in a continuous basis regarding the energy, related taxation. You know it better than me, so I am not getting into or jumping the gun. We have to wait and see how government will get into that. That's one thing. Second is the macroeconomic policy question. Your question is not exactly confined to the fuel related taxation, but in general how it can affect the direct and indirect taxation, the war. The war, mainly the fallout of the war is, of course, the supply side shocks, the supply chain disruptions, and that can affect the tax collections, and we need to look into those supply chain disruptions in order to tackle that issue. And of course, the inflation, that's another important element which we need to look into. So these are the main things, like how we tackle the inflation, how we tackle the supply chain disruptions. These are important when it comes to how the tax responds to it, because it is growth related. And when the growth when the growth is decelerating, that will show up in the tax collection as well. That is there. And as I mentioned earlier, one can be growth, the next can be non-growth component, in which we can also enhance the tax collection through the other channels, by strengthening the administrative channels, by making digital infrastructure, strengthening digital infrastructure, many other administrative channels. So the growth channel, there's an uncertainty, and that macroeconomic uncertainty, it's very hard to measure this moment.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Akhilesh. Thank you.
Now we have another question from Madam Ankita Singh. Ma'am.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Ma'am, you spoke about as to how monetary policy's primary objectives are price stability and inflation management. And post-COVID, we saw that it was the focus had shifted on growth. But now again, it seems that the focus, what I understand and what I've read in the articles, that the focus is back again on inflation and monetary tightening, inflation control. So, ma'am, we've been talking about in this lecture, and I think ma'am had also asked a question related to that. Ma'am, how do the economists know where to strike that balance, or it's more of wait and watch post a policy change is brought in? Like, for example, we have now increased the interest rates, so it's more like we wait and watch the effect of increase in interest rate, and then we predict.
Excuse me, Akhila, that's a very brilliant question. That's related to the communication strategy of RBI governor. And of course, Jay Powell or any central bank governor, the timing of pitching an announcement, that's a different literature altogether, related to unanticipated announcements and how the investors' confidence or how market respond to that, and the financial exuberance. That question relates to communication. How do you communicate? Excuse me. That's exactly the IMF, Geeta Gopinath also. This question was asked to her, that how do you strike the balance, or how do you maneuver this fiscal and policy policy space, fiscal and monetary policy space. So there, her articulation was also how you communicate. That's very relevant, and that communication is very relevant to get the investors' confidence. And timing, that's an what do you call it? It's a very brilliant question, and I don't think that even RBI governor knows what could be that timing in which he has to do this process. It's always a learning by doing process and wait and watch, rather than a prior model. Otherwise, in the April meetings, we could have increased the interest rate, but we have not done that. We introduced a new tool of SDF by maneuvering the policy corridor, but kept the interest rate untouched. But then we understood that the things are changing. Exogenous factors are different right now because of the Fed move and because of the war in Ukraine and energy price volatility and mounting inflation. So they didn't wait for the June NPC. Before that, they announced it. But this unanticipated announcement can trigger, panic in the market. That's what we were fearing. Jayant Verma, one of the NPC committee members, he was, giving right noise even, before 6 months, that our reputation risk will be there if you don't increase the interest rate right now. Because if you are responding to it through a panic response, when things go out of hand, when the inflation mount, if you increase the interest rate, then that gets into the wage and price spiral. Then, as Harish or somebody asked me about, that rupee will depreciate. So a lot of things will happen if you do a very panic kind of a increase in the interest rate. So that's why this is right. We understood that things are going haywire. So we came in and increased at 40 BPS. So we can expect a series of tightening of the monetary policy space right now in order to avoid that panic, increase in the rate. Then growth will not happen. If that panic increase in the interest rate happens after a prolonged, keeping the interest rate constant for the growth recovery process, if you don't respond to the mounting inflation, if you keep on, keeping it at the status quo, then when you increase it, that panic thing can affect the growth process also then. That's why I think it's quite all right for the RBI to get into the series of increasing, and we can expect monetary policy tightening in the June meeting as well. So that's a way, it's a very brilliant question, but we experiment it. You have any supplementary, points to, to tell? Please go ahead, Akhila. You're muted, Akhila. I can't hear.
Yes.
Yeah.
Ma'am, I don't have anything to add further. What, in fact, this is what my understanding as well, because the economic atmosphere is not only governed by one particular policy. There are too many players. The monetary policy is there. You have the fiscal policy, and very dynamic players are there. So, as you said, that no model can predict the effect of what the policy changes that we are bringing in. So it is, I think, that's what my understanding was, that we bring in a change, we wait and watch, we do have our expectations from it, and then we see how it turns out to be. One good thing that, ma'am, I understood, something new that I learned here in response to my question, was that the communication and the timing, and how RBI, basically the central bank, should not be panicking. That, ma'am, it never struck me that those are also considerations that the central bank is taking into while announcing such things. So thank you so much, ma'am.
Absolutely.
And ma'am, you also said that government has brought some, RBI has brought some monetary policy instruments, because when they were faced with a challenge as to whether they should increase the rates, and they did not want to do it because they wanted to continue with the accommodative policy stance, so they brought in certain other instruments in between so that they could continue with the same rate for some more time. So these challenges bring automatic responses, which make us learn new things about how to tackle situations.
Absolutely. And how we anchor the inflationary expectations, that matters a lot. You're right. Yes.
So, ma'am, I think it's time now, and we would have gone more with you, but certainly your time is precious, and we'd like to respect that. And I know that if I were to ask my participants to start asking questions, they could go on for an hour, but maybe some other time we'll do that. And many thanks to you for having taken out time, very, very precious time for us, and our institute, from all our officers of our institute, we thank you, and on behalf of our participants also, for the great learning that we had for the last 1 hour with you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you.